Under President Trump, the United States of America will once again take on the task of renewal and restoration, driven by a vision of a future as proud, as sovereign, and as vital as our civilization's past. And while we are prepared, if necessary, to do this alone, it is our preference and it is our hope to do this together with you, our friends here in Europe. For the United States and Europe, we belong together.
Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Wendy Song. As the world continued to grapple with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific, and deepening unrest across the Middle East, the Munich Security Conference, it brings world leaders together to search for answers. And yet, has anything actually changed after the meeting? And is there a new framework for global security emerging? Or are we simply standing by watching the old one gradually collapse? And also look at this. This is the cover of this year's Munich Security Report. An image of Taiwan inlaid within the image of an elephant. The message is clear. Taiwan is the elephant in the room. Taiwan is at the very heart of global security. Not a single world leader named Taiwan explicitly from the podium. And yet Taiwan was everywhere. In every warning, every diplomatic alarm. What does all this mean for Taiwan and the world? Joining me today are Jieting Ye, Farron, Augustine, and Alexander venture partner and U.S. Taiwan Watch board director. Also Andrew Ye, who is China Strategic Risk Institute executive director. Andrew, Jieting, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So I want to jump right in here. Last year, we know that J.D. Vance, the U.S. Vice President, he gave a speech also at the MSC, one that was characterized by a more, let's say, confrontational, more assertive tone, let's put it that way. And whereas this year, Marco Rubio seemed to be taking a more softer approach. I'm wondering, maybe I'll start with Jieting to start out with. Jieting, what do you make of this contrast between last year and this year's different tone? Do they mean anything? Do they tell you something about structural shift, more broadly speaking?
I don't think there's a structural shift going on per se. I think it's really a difference of tone, right? So you have different personalities coming from Vice President Vance and Secretary of State Rubio, but I think the overall message is the same of what's called reciprocity, right? So the United States feel that it has been shouldering the burden of defense, common defense, to the detriment of the United States, right? And I think it's really how do you, I think on Washington's end, how do you get European allies to contribute more to defense, whether you go with a harder approach or go with a softer approach, you use carrots or sticks, but I think the message is the same, that the United States wants Europe to contribute more to their own defense.
Andrew, what do you make of Rubio's softer tone at the MSC? Do you finding it going down well in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it could have gone down worse than Vance's speech year before. So I think it's definitely an improvement in that terms. I mean, if you think about the history of the US and Europe since 1945, the end of the Second World War, I mean, we have really such an intertwined economic, security, and people-to-people relationship. Europe is not used to being lectured by the US in this way, and it's not used to being bullied or cajoled in the way that Vance was attempting to last year. So I think Vance put European leaders in a very difficult position. Even if the leaders themselves agreed with Vance's message, they couldn't possibly go back to their domestic audiences and agree with him when he spoke to them like that. So I do think that Rubio's tone is much more appropriate and will get better results.
Right, so softer tone sounds like definitely going down easier than the harsher, I guess more confrontational rhetoric, at least for a European leader who got to deal with their domestic supporters. So there's a lot of emphasis in Marco Rubio's speech this year. He talked about civilizational identity. He talked about a shared cultural roots and proud common heritage between Western countries. How far do you think this appeal to common culture, common heritage will go into the patching over the relationship or the divide between US and Europe?
I mean, it's a really difficult question. It depends how people interpret his remarks. I mean, obviously, the US and Europe do have lots of shared cultural heritage. Many Americans, their descendants, were originally migrants or refugees from Europe. So there is undoubtedly that very shared and tight people-to-people connection. But I think the problem with the language that Marco Rubio has used around civilization or identity is that this is also language that has been adopted by the far right, both in the US and in Europe, to try and exclude religious and ethnic minorities and migrants from the life, from the civic society of these countries. So I think some might be quite reticent about that kind of language being used to describe the relationship.
Interesting. So that common civilizational root argument could be uniting, but could also be potentially exclusionary for some in that way. I want to come to Jieting. How effective, how far do you think Marco Rubio's speech this time will be effective, again, in improving the ties between the two sides?
I have my doubts. I think just the actions of President Trump and what is kind of coming out of Washington throughout this past 2 years, I think Europe kind of understands what is at stake here. Europe understands that the messaging is the same, right? And so I think in addition to that, I think there is a fundamental loss of trust between Europe and the United States right now, right? So I think, perhaps if this is a beginning in a series of change in tone, perhaps there is, more room between US and Europe. But I think for now, I think we kind of have to wait and see if European, leaders are going to take this, kind of at face value.
All right, so same message across both speeches last year and this year. And I think that points to something that other observers have talked about as well, which is the consistency that U.S. has been urging allies to pull their own weight a little bit more, and that U.S. support is becoming a bit more conditional, let's say, than before as well. So Andrew, I'm wondering, do you see a genuine paradigm shift in the nature of world order coming up? And if so, what kind of world order is replacing the old that we're more familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think what we've seen under the Trump administration is that he certainly feels he can get a lot more done and a lot more done quickly by bypassing multilateral institutions and looking to cut deals on a bilateral or minilateral level. Of course, the world order is still there, particularly the UN-based multilateral institutions, and China is very happy to come in and fill the gap. I mean, we saw this with China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi at the UN Human Rights Council this week. It's laughable, the idea that China can adopt leadership on human rights globally, but without the US there, they're very happy to try and fill that gap.
I think there's definitely a paradigm shift happening. I think it's a little too early to tell if there's a new order that's replacing the old order. I would call the situation right now a global disorder, right? So the old order is being broken up. There's a lot of flux, and I think we're just going to have to see if there's a new, kind of arrangement that's happened. But I think right now, a lot of things are up for, a lot of things are on the table.
And I think one important factor here, of course, in all of this is Taiwan, the big elephant in the room. And Jieting, I'm wondering, where do you see Taiwan's place is in this world order today? Where does Taiwan stand? Is Taiwan becoming a new fault line, if you will, of global politics?
I think, in terms of a new world order, right? I think, you could say this is a crisis for Taiwan because Taiwan's quest for recognition and for formal sovereignty, right, and for statehood is really predicated on the existing nation state or order, right? Yet I think this is also an opportunity for Taiwan because Taiwan obviously has a lot of strengths, and Taiwan, does uphold universal values of freedom, human rights, democracy, right? And so I think this is really a time of flux where I think Taiwan can actually, Taiwan plays its cards right, can actually be an opportunity for Taiwan.
All right, so with crisis may lie opportunity for Taiwan in that sense. I think same question for Andrew. Again, where do you see Taiwan's place is in the world order today? And perhaps what does MSC mean for Taiwan, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jieting. I think it is both a risk and an opportunity for Taiwan. I think it's a risk, particularly if Trump really tries to build forward this G2 agenda with President Xi Jinping and having a grand bargain between China and US setting the global agenda. I think Taiwan's place in that is very uncertain. But I do also think it's an opportunity. I mean, Taiwan has been systematically excluded from the UN by China. So if there are more approaches to solving global problems that don't rely on the UN and its institutions, I do think that's a real opportunity for Taiwan.
Thank you for that answer. I want to pivot to a related topic, and that is a speech from German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. He made a historic declaration at the MSC this year when he said that the rules-based international order that emerged after World War II is now over. Let's take a look.
Ich habe keinen Zweifel. Wir werden in dieser Welt unsere Interessen und unsere Werte bewahren. Zumindest dann, wenn wir entschieden, gemeinsam und mit Selbstvertrauen auf die eigene Stärke setzen.
So Merz warned that Europe's freedom is no longer guaranteed, and he called on Europe to show firmness and determination. For a German chancellor, this is, of course, a profound departure from decades of post-war restraint. I want to ask Jieting for the next question. This talk from German Chancellor about big power politics, how do you think that tells us about where Germany is heading in terms of its position between U.S.-China bipolarity that's been emerging, and what does it tell us about, I guess, Europe, or more generally speaking?
You know, I think in terms of Europe, right? So Germany is, of course, kind of the bellwether, right? So Europe kind of follows Germany's lead because it is the, it is the largest, power within the European community.
Geopolitically, almost the first among equals in that sense, right?
Right. And so I think, it's quite telling for Germany to say, we are going to find our own way, essentially, and that, I think the existing world order, post-war order, as defined by kind of guaranteed, backed by United States military might, that may be over, right? But I think for Germany, there is still room for Europe to kind of carry the torch of upholding the universal values of democracy, human rights, freedom, and then backing it with its own military might. So,
all right. So let's observe where they're heading next. One phenomenon that we've been seeing lately is that of Western powers making their way to Beijing for various China visits lately. So since 2026 started, let me count. UK, Finland, Canada, Ireland, and Germany, their leaders have all made visits to Beijing, seemingly trying to carve out a more balanced position in between US and China, in between, I guess, Washington's unilateralism and China's growing ambition, if you will. So, Andrew, I'm wondering, do you see this phenomenon as Western powers trying to re-engage China? Do you see that as a sign of gradual erosion of the coherence of Western bloc, or are we being too alarmist here?
I mean, I think there is a lot which is quite ordinary about the fact that European leaders want to visit Beijing and want to meet with the Chinese leadership. I mean, that's happened in the pre-Xi era. It's happened in the Xi era as well. I think the pause was more to do with COVID and the pandemic rather than anything else. So I don't think there's too much cause for alarm in that sense. I think the sense in Europe is more just that this is a time where they can't afford for the relationship with China to go wrong. They're fighting a war in Ukraine with Russia. The transatlantic relationship is more uncertain than it ever has been. The European economy as a whole is extremely sluggish and slow. And so it's more about kind of normalizing and protecting relationships with China rather than some approach of a golden era desire.
Okay, so related question for Jieting on this. Some people observing this trend about Western power going to China have talked about how it's a sign of quote-unquote pragmatic adjustment. And some observers have even argued that Taiwan perhaps should also consider making its own pragmatic adjustment in that way, perhaps considering an equal distance position between US and China. What's your take on this suggestion?
So I think, first of all, if you read the recent article in Foreign Affairs about reciprocity by Oren Cass, right? So he does talk about the United States communicating to its allies that the United States assistance and alliance is not to be taken for granted, right? That United States does have the option of walking away from the table, such as it is, right? But then, so Europeans or other allies, right, once they understand that the United States has the option of leaving the table, they have to find alternative options as well, right? So I think there is some of that mentality happening. But I think Taiwan's case is different, right? Because China is actively threatening to annex Taiwan, right? And so, having a kind of on the surface, equal distant relationship between Beijing, and for Taipei to be between Beijing and Washington, right? You're going to be much closer to Beijing, to China's efforts to annex Taiwan.
Right, so it's interesting, right? So whoever trying to argue for equal distance position for Taiwan will have to take into account that Taiwan doesn't have the luxury of distance from China, that the way that maybe other Western powers might have. I want to come to Andrew about the other power in the room here, and that is China. We just talked about evolving relationship between Western countries, between US and Europe, for example. How do you think China is reacting to this? Do you think China is happy about this so-called talk about big power politics era? Or, and if so, how is China trying to capitalize on this?
Yeah, well, I think China is trying to win on both fronts. I mean, China is a big power, economically, militarily, technologically, there's no doubt about it. So if we're entering a world in which big powers like China are less constrained by international law, I think that's broadly very positive from their perspective. But at the same time, they will continue to use the UN and other institutions to build support for their diplomatic agenda, to push the narratives that they want to push out. And so they'll try and use it to present a softer face at the same time.
All right, so two-level game from China. We're seeing hard power and soft power in that way. So I want to zoom out a little bit and move our spotlight onto the more US side, domestic side of the equation here. US House Representative AOC, that is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she was asked a direct question at the Munich Security Conference, namely, should the US commit to sending troops to defend Taiwan if China invaded? She paused for roughly 20 seconds before giving a, let's say, not fully committal response. Take a look.
Would and should the U.S. actually commit U.S. troops to defend Taiwan if China were to move?
I think that this is such a, I think that this is a, this is, of course, a very long-standing policy of the United States. And I think what we are hoping for is that we want to make sure that we never get to that point. And we want to make sure that we are moving in all of our economic research and our global positions to avoid any such confrontation and for that question to even arise.
So watching that, some observers have called that response ambivalent. Some observers have called it unfamiliarity with the Taiwan issue. Jiating, what's your take here, and what do you think that moment tell us about the thinking on Taiwan policy inside Democratic Party, or at least inside AOC?
I don't think that, to me, tells me very much, other than that she was kind of caught off guard. As we all understand, U.S. policy towards Taiwan is, if anything, nuanced, right? And word choice matters, the tone matters, and so I think it's only right that politicians and leaders take caution when they try to answer this question, right? And this is not, this policy is not set by one representative. Right, this policy is not even set exclusively by the U.S. Congress, right? And so this is, I think it's a little unfair to have one representative, one member of the U.S. Congress, one remark, and take that, and to take that, and then to take that to mean what the Democratic Party really thinks at this moment.
Okay, that's good to know. So at least that caution shows that she's at least aware of the gravity of the importance of the U.S.-Taiwan relations, hence the caution about precise wording. One other important U.S. leader is U.S. Undersecretary of Defense Elbridge Colby. He also made a comment about Taiwan during the MSC. Take a look.
Obviously, our position on Taiwan remains the same. It's a very sensitive issue in our relations all around, and particularly with the People's Republic. So I won't comment in any way on what's going on in Taiwan. I will merely address the broader concept of tough love.
When asked about U.S.'s tough love for Taiwan, Colby said that the U.S. used to be a over-assuring and over-indexed on this issue, and now he wants to adapt towards a more balanced and conditional position. So, Andrew, I'm wondering, what do you make of that response from Albert Colby, and is that signal something we should be concerned about?
Yeah, well, I do think Taiwan and Europe actually find themselves in quite similar positions on this issue. I mean, both Taiwan and Europe have very warm relations with the US historically. The US has a strong security interest in both Taiwan and Europe. That much is very clear. But I think for both Europe and Taiwan, there is a real need to invest in their own defense, to convince the US that they're not just free riding on American support, but actually are willing to invest their own resources too into this defense. And I think that's critically important with Taiwan's politics at the moment as well.
Thank you for that. Jieting, I got a feeling you had something you want to add?
Oh, and I just want to remind everyone that the sort of the U.S. debate over whether or not to, other countries are so-called free riders, right? A lot of that is a response for a domestic audience, right? So, historically within the United States, both on the right and the left, right, there are internationalists and there are also isolationists, right? People who say the United States is investing too much into what's going on with other people, other parts of the world, right? And so I think, leaders in European capitals as well as in Taipei, right, need to understand that a lot of this rhetoric is really directed towards the domestic audience and to convince them that the United States is not over-investing American resources helping other countries, right? So, I think leaders in both European capitals and in Taipei, should kind of keep that in mind and to say, okay, well, of course, your one nation's defense is the responsibility of that nation first and foremost, right? So, I think as long as that messaging is conveyed towards the American people, I think there is going to be more room for kind of further relationship building.
Right, yes, so we help those who help themselves, right? That's the argument. One other factor during the MSC, I should say, is that China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Wang Yi came to Munich with a dual message, seemingly trying to divide and conquer the US and Europe. Take a look.
就是对华脱钩断链，逢中必反，搞各种针对中国的小圈子、小集团，甚至怂恿策划台湾来分裂中国。 踩踏中国的红线，那就很有可能使中美陷入对抗。
So the rhetoric seems to be bifurcated in a way. Wang Yi talks to the U.S. about how Taiwan is a red line, and he talked about Taiwan to the Europeans. He talked in a much more positive term. He's like, China, Europe, we are partners, not rivals, and that China is upholding a multilateralism, partnership, language like that. So, Andrew, do you feel like Wang Yi or China, more broadly speaking, is trying to drive a wedge at this moment between US and Europe?
I do think they're trying to drive a wedge, and to use a more social media term, I think they're trying to gaslight Europe, right? I mean, the fact is they're talking about Europe and China as partners, and of course, in trade and other areas, there are places where Europe and China can work together. But I mean, at the same time, we've very much seen China support Russia in its war in Ukraine, and that is a core security issue for Europe. We've seen China conduct cyber attacks, espionage, a whole range of tactics against European security. And then there's also the overcapacity issues. There are, huge numbers of Chinese subsidized goods which are effectively wiping out industries across Europe. So within that context, I don't think too many European leaders will truly believe Wang Yi at his word that there is this sincere partnership between China and Europe.
One more question for Jieting as well. And this is usually when in academic seminar, this is what we call the, policy recommendation section of the discussion. So Jieting, any recommendation you have for Taiwan in terms of how Taiwan can better, strengthen its relation with Europe and to cement its importance in the international discussions?
Sure, I think the obvious answer here is to invest more in defense, right? And of course, there is the additional defense spending bill that is in legislature in Taiwan right now. But kind of furthermore, if the people show a willingness, right, to say we want to actually pay more taxes to modernize and to reform our military and to give them better equipment, give them better resources, right? But I think this may sound actually a little counterintuitive, but I do actually think focusing a little bit away on exclusively defense and security issues, right? And for Taiwan's leader and for Taiwan's people to communicate to the world that we're not only concerned and investing in our defense, but we are also investing in Taiwan just becoming a better country overall, right? Because we still have to live, and Taiwan still has to live. Taiwan still has to move forward, right? And to say, you know what, like Taiwan is not only in survival mode, right? We are not just surviving, but we're thriving, right? So I think if Taiwan can show that kind of confidence to the world, I think that would really go a long way to cement that relationship between Taiwan, Europe, and also even with the United States.
That's inspiring to hear from you, Jieting. Any final comments or recommendations from you, Andrew?
Yeah, I would agree with Jieting. I think Taiwan needs to tell a much better story about why it matters to Europe and other democratic countries around the world. I think the response you saw from AOC, hesitating for 20 seconds before answering the question, I think a lot of European policymakers would also struggle to give a coherent account of what their government's policy on Taiwan is. It simply isn't on the map for a lot of European policymakers. So I think for Taiwan to tell its story better, for Europe to become more educated on why Taiwan matters, I think that has to be the priority.
Nice, and actually that point I think really resonates because I remember listening to Jake Sullivan, that's the former US National Security Advisor under Biden. He did a podcast episode where he talked about Taiwan policy specifically, and when he talked about a section about one China policy, he said he actually went back to read for the actual text multiple times to make sure you get the details right. So that tells you about how the level of nuance all these aspects of policy can be. But on that note though, Andrew, Jieting, I'd like to thank you both so much for sharing your time and expertise with our audience today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So if you like our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today, and I'll see you next time.